Good evening, everyone. I'm very excited to welcome you all to this evening's University Colloquium. The University Colloquium is hosted by the rector of this university, Elmer Sterken, and is organized in collaboration between Studium Generale and the Young Academy Groningen, specifically the working group on interdisciplinarity. Interdisciplinarity should never be an end in itself. Just because we analyze research questions from two or more different disciplines or perspectives doesn't mean that added value is created. Interdisciplinary perspectives are valuable when they utilize methods and insight from one discipline to solve problems in another discipline. The central questions we face in contemporary society will not be solvable in monodisciplinary fashion. We will need to shift perspectives, to think beyond the edge of the plate, as we would say in German, or beyond the tip of my nose, as the Dutch saying would go. For this reason, we are very delighted to welcome Joshua Goldstein to Groningen today. Professor Goldstein is Professor Emeritus of International Relations at the American University in Washington, D.C., and research scholar at the University of Massachusetts. He has made important contributions to a variety of fields and integrated different disciplines. His work has been published in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, American Political Science Review, Journal of Conflict Resolution, and International Studies Quarterly, next to contributions to the New York Times and the Washington Post. His books focus on war, conflict, and societal questions. War and Gender, published in 2001, sheds light on how gender is embedded in conceptions of war and aggression, and how gender norms shape men, women, and children to the needs of war. War and Gender has won the International Studies Association's Book of the Decade Award. Winning the War on War, published in 2011, describes how armed conflict around the world is decreasing, even if public opinion states differently, and how UN efforts for peacekeeping book success. Winning the War on War won the Book of the Year Award of the Conflict Research Society. In his latest work, A Bright Future, written together with Swedish engineer Stefan Quist, Professor Goldstein discusses how the world should look to Sweden to tackle climate change. And with this, I would like to invite you now to the stage and let us hear or share your insights on this topic.
Thank you. It's great to be here in the Netherlands where I can improve my English speaking. And I appreciate being able to speak in English, but it's better than if I try to use another language. And thanks to the Young Academy and the university for hosting this talk. This is largely based on my book, A Bright Future, with Stefan Quist, my co-author there. But I'm also going to extend into some other directions, talking about things that go beyond just the focus of the book. And it all started back in California. This is me as a 19-year-old. In the 1970s, I was an environmentalist, and I believed that technology was not really to be trusted, and nature was better than anything technological. I thought back to the land was good, and small is beautiful, and nuclear power in particular was not something one would like. And then I had children, and I started to think about the longer-term future, and my son in particular became a climate change activist, and my children convinced me that climate change was the issue that really mattered. My son at age 22 was elected to the Massachusetts state legislature and is now writing a book called The 100% Solution about how to really solve climate change as opposed to just doing things that move in the right direction and feel good. How do we really solve it? And so I want to acknowledge his role in teaching me about some of the things I'll talk about tonight. In his and his children's, hypothetical children's lifetimes, the long-term consequences of climate change could be absolutely catastrophic for humanity. And I'm not going to elaborate that point because you're probably agree already, or you wouldn't be here. I will say this is where I was born, Boston, and across the river where I got my doctorate at MIT. And I'd mentioned that I showed this slide to the engineers at MIT, and they said, this is okay, we're on the 4th floor of the building. That's your MIT engineers. So I started studying climate change in detail. And the first thing I learned is that business as usual is increasing the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, which is already so high that it's warming the planet. And if we go on that way, we have a future that I don't want to leave to my children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. But the Paris Agreement, which is the best that the international system has come up with, and I'm an international relations scholar, I'm really happy that they could all get together and agree on something, but what they agreed on won't solve the problem. Paris Agreement will just flatten out emissions, which are already too high. In fact, the emissions now, which would continue under Paris, are the equivalent of making 15 billion SUVs out of carbon and putting them in the atmosphere every year, 15 billion. What we need to do, by contrast, is to reduce emissions rapidly. The UN reports, the IPCC reports tell us this. By mid-century, we need to cut carbon out and stop putting more into the atmosphere. And that's an enormous task because the world economy runs on fossil fuels now. So to cut them out in just 15 years is a huge undertaking. And even while we're doing that, we need to be increasing energy while we reduce emissions. And in fact, as I'll show, we'll actually need a lot more energy as we go along. You might think, as I used to when I was a young environmentalist, that we can conserve our way out of the problem. We'll just use less energy, we'll be more in tune with nature. But you can't actually conserve your way to decarbonization, although it's a fine thing to do, to use less energy. This graphic shows that we can solve our problems if we just eat less meat and turn off the lights and build wind turbines, which seem to be about several thousand kilometers tall. So this is a step in the right direction. It's a way of signaling virtue, and it actually is virtuous to conserve and to be environmentally friendly. But what we've learned now is that it's not working. We're not on track to actually rapidly reduce carbon emissions. Part of the problem with conserving is that most of the growth in energy is happening in poor countries. The poorer countries in the next 30 years are where the big growth will happen, and that has to happen while we're reducing emissions because it's a great thing to have more energy in those poor countries. For people who don't have access to electricity, the prospect is for manual labor to do things that we in richer countries take for granted with electricity. So the idea that it's virtuous to use less electricity might sound great in the Netherlands, and it's true to a point, but it's not going to sound so great to these women in India trying to grind sugarcane by hand. 1 billion people now lack access to the electric grid at all, and several billion more have insecure supplies of electricity. In particular, one poor country has grown in the last couple of decades, pulling hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, and it's been a wonderful thing. China has taken people from abject poverty right up into the standards of a middle-income country. Unfortunately, it's come at the expense of rapidly rising carbon emissions and rapidly rising use of coal. If you look at the graph for Chinese coal emissions, it looks a lot like the blue line on this graph. And I wondered what caused the sudden uptick there in the graph, and it was in fact China joining the World Trade Organization. So what happened is that the things that used to be made in a dirty way in the Netherlands and other richer countries are now made in China. And it goes onto their carbon budget so that it looks like the EU and the US emissions are coming down. They are by that accounting. But in fact, they're not really coming down, they're just moving to China. So we've exported our carbon emissions. And I say this because conserving and, we'll do less and we're on the right track, we're reducing our emissions. Well, not so much. We're shifting them to China. Now, The second reason that we need more energy, and specifically more electricity, is that we need to electrify the things that are not electrified now. So this is a graph of world carbon emissions. Where do they come from? Simplified, obviously. And 1/4 of it is the electric grid, and yet that's where all the attention is. We'll put in renewable power, we'll conserve energy, we'll invent batteries. It's all the electric sector. But we need to also, from the electric sector, then decarbonize industry, transportation, heating of buildings, and a few other little things. And then after that, we need to deal with agriculture and land use, deforestation, which I'm not going to talk about tonight, but is important, has to be part of the total solution. So electrifying all these things is going to mean we need to produce more electricity. And then by mid-century, we need to start sucking carbon out of the atmosphere, sequestering carbon from the atmosphere and putting it back into the ground or the ocean. And although there are some ways to do this now that are very expensive, every way to do this in the end is probably going to involve a lot of more use of electricity. I mean, you can plant trees and that's great up to a point, but then you're going to need to have giant fans that suck carbon out of the atmosphere, more electricity. And finally, we need to desalinate water now, especially with climate change and droughts. And desalinization is perfectly feasible, but it uses a lot of electricity. So all in all, we're going to need vast amounts of cheap, clean electricity by mid-century, just vast amounts. I'll put a number on it. It's about 200 petawatt hours per year. Right now we use about 25 petawatt hours of electricity per year worldwide. So an 8-fold expansion of electric generation, all the while getting rid of the 85% of electricity that's powered by fossil fuels. And the story of electricity in the 21st century is the story of coal. Coal dominates all the other generating fuels, with methane coming in second place, methane being natural gas. And coal is a dirty story. This is a plant that we talk about in the book that's in Germany, where they mine the coal nearby. It's lignite, which is dirty coal, and they burn it in the plant to generate electricity. If you made elephants out of coal and marched them into the plant, 10,000 elephants would go in every day, or a coal train 5 miles long. The next day, another 5 miles or another 10,000 elephants. So just vast amounts of coal. And at the other end, after it's burned, coal releases particulate matter into the air. It causes emphysema, it causes cancer, heart disease, and overall, the use of coal to generate electricity kills more than 500,000 people worldwide every year, and especially in places like China and India where it's getting hard to breathe. Now, methane gas, natural gas, portrays itself as cleaner than coal, and it is cleaner than coal. It doesn't kill those people from emphysema. But, and this is Shell Natural Gas, a company you might have heard of here, that is advertising itself as a great partner for renewable power sources. That's because renewables come and go, as you know, intermittently, and then when they go, natural gas can kick in quickly to keep the grid running so that you don't have blackouts every time the renewables drop out. But there's a couple of problems with methane, first of which is it's still putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, about half as much as coal per kilowatt hour. But if you're going to ramp up electricity 8-fold, and then you're going to do it with methane gas, you're going to end up with more carbon in the atmosphere than you're getting from coal now, even though it's only half as much per kilowatt hour. The second problem with natural gas, there is some hope on natural gas on that first problem, and that is to capture the carbon in carbon capture plants. This is one in Houston that is still in the testing phase, but they hope that it can generate electricity from natural gas without the carbon emissions at about the same price that we do now with carbon emissions. That would be a big help. But the second problem with natural gas is that it leaks into the atmosphere all along the line. And the Russian natural gas, which is a big part of the world picture, is notoriously leaky. But everywhere you go, little bits of natural gas are leaking in from the wellhead all the way along to your stove in your house or furnace. This picture shows a natural gas leak in Los Angeles not long ago that they were storing the natural gas in underground caverns. It began to leak, It's invisible, nobody knew what was going on. It sickened the neighborhood, then they had to evacuate the neighborhood. And this went on for months. This is an infrared picture, so it's invisible except to the infrared. And vast amounts of natural gas leaked out, so it's kind of a magnified version of what's happening every day. The problem is methane gas in the atmosphere is 80 times stronger than CO2 as a greenhouse gas on the time scale that's relevant, a few decades. So if you're, again, going to crank up electricity 8-fold from what it is now, and you do it with methane gas, even if you're capturing it, the carbon, a lot of it's going to leak, and you're going to end up, worse off than now on your greenhouse gases. It's not the route to decarbonization. It's kind of a false hope for decarbonization, because, well, it's cleaner than coal and it works with renewables, but you're going to increase greenhouse gases, both on carbon and on methane. So why not take fossil fuels off the grid altogether and replace them 100% with renewables? This is the politically popular, easy choice. And I want to say right up front, I like renewables. I have solar panels on my house to power my electric car. Renewables are fun. They're popular. If they would work, that would be the easiest, quickest thing. You just put them on really fast because everybody would applaud, and it would be a big win, especially for the politicians. But when we say renewables, people think of wind and solar. You see it in this picture. But actually, most renewables are hydroelectric power. That's the predominant source of renewables now. Wind and solar are much smaller, although growing. Hydroelectric power, from an economic point of view and from a climate point of view, decarbonizing, is a great power source because it's cheap and it's clean, it's carbon clean. But it has a couple of drawbacks, the biggest of which is that most of the good hydroelectric sites in the world are already dammed up. So if you have it, that's great, but you've probably already dammed it up, you're already using it. So it's not something you can use to grow electricity supply 8-fold in the world. The second problem is that, as you see in the picture, it does create large areas that are flooded, and that destroys the local ecosystems. In particular, right now, the Mekong River Delta in Southeast Asia is having a lot of hydro dams built, and it's really doing damage to the environment there. Okay, so what about solar panels? They're popular, they're cheap, they're becoming really cheap. And they bill themselves as, the answer is build enough solar panels. And the problem with solar, the big problem with solar, one problem is that it does what hydro does, but on a smaller scale. That is, takes a lot of land, a lot of area, and replaces green with steel and concrete and silicon. In fact, in Massachusetts right now, I don't know if you're doing this, we're clear-cutting forests to put in solar farms. And it just doesn't make sense to me. But the bigger problem with solar is that it doesn't work some of the time. It's intermittent. And here's Europe at night, the lights are all on, but there's no solar power, obviously. Stefan Kvist, my co-author, did a study of the European continent and its energy use for a whole year, and he found that during 1 week of that year, neither solar nor wind were producing. They were both below 10%. And it raises the question, if you're going to 100% renewables, what happens during that week? We don't have batteries that can store a whole continent's energy for a week, and we're not going to have them in the next 30 years. That's completely out of sight. You're not going to probably want to go without electricity for a week. And so then you're left with the idea of some kind of backup system. And what that backup system will be is fossil fuels. It'll be your natural gas, the perfect partner for renewables. But that means you need an entire fossil fuel infrastructure. You need the gas pipelines, the liquefied natural gas, the methane burning power plants, and all of that, all of which will lock you into a fossil economy for decades into the future, just to back up the times when renewables don't produce. Wind turbines are also economical in a lot of places, and I saw a lot of them on the train up here from Amsterdam. I see that you're going in for wind. They do kill birds, so that's unfortunate, and they do also take a lot of land area. But mostly, as I'm going to show, they just don't scale fast enough. Again, the energy source is diffuse, not nearly as concentrated as fossil fuels. And we can learn this empirically by looking at the results of Germany's efforts to power itself with renewables. Over the last decade, Germany has gone all in to change over in an energy transition from coal and nuclear power to renewables. They've spent very large amounts of money on it. They have political consensus about it, and they've put in a lot of renewables. And you see the messaging on it. It's that it's not a dream, it's a reality. It's the lesson that we can all learn from. It's proven, et cetera. So what do you think it's done for Germany's carbon emissions in that decade? And there's the answer. They haven't come down. So this is a failed transition so far, but it's a useful experiment. And the reason they haven't come down is it's slow to put renewables on the grid, number one, and number two, they're taking nuclear power, which is carbon-free, off the grid while they're adding renewables. I'll tell you more about that later. So we can look on a scale from green to brown here in terms of how many grams of carbon are emitted for every kilowatt hour you produce of electricity. This is a wonderful website I would recommend you look at yourself. It's called electricitymap.org. You can click on the Netherlands. You can see how green your electricity is, answer somewhere in the middle. And you can see how it's changing day to day and where your fuels are coming from to generate that electricity. Countries like China are not on there yet because they'd be really brown. So the brown end of it, which would be coal, is about 800 to 900 grams per kilowatt hour. And the middle, 500, is the world average. Generating entirely from natural gas, that would be about 300. And then renewables, down below 50. But what we need to do is to get the world from the brown, the 500 that we're at now, down to below 50, 90% reduction in carbon while generating all this electricity. And you can see some places have fluctuated between different shades of brown, and this would include both Germany and the Netherlands. But I'd point especially to Germany. When the sun is shining and the wind is blowing, they're not as brown. And when that stops, then they go browner. They pull out the coal and natural gas to replace it with. Other places, like Norway, the South Island of New Zealand, and Brazil to some extent, have a pretty steadily green profile, and it's because they have hydroelectric. These are the lucky countries. Norway, what you should do is build a big transmission cable from Norway to here, and then you'd have some of their green energy. But you can't get enough through the cable to power yourself, so I'm just kidding about that. The hydroelectric countries are lucky, but there are a couple of countries in there that are not hydroelectric, and I'd point you to Sweden and to France and to Ontario province in Canada as places that are green around the clock, any season, 24 hours a day, all year long. And these are the places that are using nuclear power to power their grids. And that was what got me interested in nuclear power, even though I hated it when I was younger, because I thought, this is empirical success. This is not a model or a theory or anything. This is what's actually happening out there. Some countries, the some countries of my book subtitle, are successfully decarbonizing, and other ones are not. Particularly Germany and Sweden provide contrasting cases. And these are pleasant and prosperous places to live. This is not, great sacrifices they've made to decarbonize. Sweden, France, Toronto. In fact, if you look at all the countries that have put clean energy onto the grid quickly, the blue cases here are doing it with nuclear power. The green is doing it with solar and wind. So 2 out of the top, whatever that is, 12 cases are solar and wind, but most of them are nuclear power. It's faster to put nuclear power on the grid than solar and wind. We have Germany over there on the right, the 2.9, and Denmark at 2.5. Just continuing, wouldn't even be on this graph, but we've added them. So you can see that Germany actually added clean energy faster when they were building nuclear plants than they have with their recent decade of adding renewables. Now, this is the most important graph of the evening, and I want you to look at it and remember that this is the important one. This is what France did in 15 years. Took fossil fuel off the grid, just like that. Yeah, take a picture of it. Put it on social media. And put nuclear power on instead. So 15 years to decarbonize their grid. And that's what the world needs. That's what we need right now, something really fast and really massive that can decarbonize the grid in 15 years. So could it ever happen? Could it work? We know that it can because France has already done it. By the way, France's electricity prices are a little more than half the prices in Germany. So it's not too expensive. They're not sacrificing their economy. Sweden did a similar thing. Built 10 nuclear reactors really fast, even built a couple in Finland. And their carbon emissions went down by 50%. That's the whole country, not just the electric grid. Down 50% in 20 years, and meanwhile the GDP grew robustly. And this is Sweden's largest power plant at Ringhals, and I've been there. It really is as nice and as clean and beautiful as it looks in the picture. It's got 4 reactors, 4 of the 10 that they built, and this plant would power a medium city just from that little facility. And this is the amazing thing about nuclear power. It's so concentrated, you know, a million times more than fossil fuel and way more than wind or solar, which are less concentrated than fossil fuel. Because it's so concentrated is why it can roll out on the grid so fast. It's why it has a very small environmental footprint and doesn't do the things that solar or hydroelectric do to the environment. And it's why the waste stream is also very small compared to, say, coal waste. So the concentration of it. This is South Korea's latest reactor. South Korea has been very successful at rolling out nuclear plants, and this is their latest one, the APR 1400. It produces 10 billion kilowatt hours per year from that one little facility. The fuel for it would fit on a truck for a year. If you did the same thing with coal, it would take 25,000 railroad cars of coal. So that's the concentration. And if you try to do it with solar panel, you need to take everything in this whole picture and multiply it by 10. And then multiply that by 10, and then multiply that by 3, so 300 times larger than everything in this picture. That would give you the amount of energy that's produced by this one nuclear plant. With wind power, I think it's about 1,000 windmills, something on that order, wind turbines. So that's the potential of nuclear power. Potentially, it could get on the grid really fast. We could have a lot of clean electricity really fast. That's exactly what we need. And if we didn't put any new low-carbon electricity on the grid worldwide, we would start to use, the clean energy we have now would become a smaller amount of the mix, and our carbon intensity would go up. This is the same scale as that big map with the green and the brown. So the brown, 500 is the world average, 700 is getting up into coal, and then we want to get down under 50. That's the target. If we did it the way Germany did, we'd have the same result, flat emissions. But it's not really fair to just look at Germany because they are taking nuclear off while they're adding renewables. What if we only looked at the rate they're adding renewables, ignoring the fact that they're also closing down nuclear reactors? Well, then we would be decarbonizing, but far too slowly. We're out at 2060 there, and we're just coming down to from 500 to 400. We need something much faster than that. What about Germany's peak years when they added most renewables, which, by the way, were not the last 3 years, but a few years ago? Even so, it's too slow. We're not getting there. But if we did what France did when it built nuclear reactors, we could get the whole world grid decarbonized before 2050. And my Swedish co-author always likes to remind us that Sweden did it even a little faster. So let's consider the criticisms against nuclear power. That's the promise of it. What about the problems? And I'll be brief about this because I understand you've just already had a good explanation of these matters recently here. So first of all, it's dirty. And especially the dirty thing is the waste, the hazardous waste that results from nuclear power. This is usually the number one criticism I hear. We have no way to handle the spent fuel and the waste, and we're going to leave it for future generations, and we can't do that to future generations. And so then we're going to leave them an overcooked planet from climate change. Instead, it doesn't make much sense to me. But let's think about the waste. This is where waste goes after it comes out of the reactor. This is Sweden's spent fuel pool. You can stand right next to it like these people are doing because radiation doesn't go through water. It's safe there. And my co-author had the experience of standing right by that pool, the same experience I had standing by an American facility and going, What? This is what all the fuss is about? It's small. This is all the waste from all of Sweden's years of using nuclear power in that one pool. And then in the United States, we put it in these dry casks. That's what I was standing next to, an 18-foot high cask, concrete, keeps the radiation from escaping. You stand right next to it with no protective gear at all, and you don't get irradiated because they're safe. They're well designed, robust. We've never had a leak or an accident from one in the world, and they are good for another many decades, maybe 100 years. This is the nuclear waste issue that people complain about for the long term, but it's not a short-term issue. It's not a problem we need to solve right now. We could leave nuclear waste in these casks for 50 years while we decarbonize and solve climate change, and then we could come back to it and either bury it, like Finland is starting to do, or burn it in new reactors that are being designed now to use this spent fuel as new fuel in the reactor. It's so radioactive because it still has a lot of energy in it, so if you can use that, then you solve two problems at once. Coal waste, by contrast, we just dump into pools. It's vastly larger quantity than nuclear waste. Nuclear waste is contained and will be safe for decades to come. Coal waste, we put in these sludgy ponds. Sometimes the dams break and the communities downstream are flooded, always poor communities, I might add, and people die that way, but more often it just seeps into the groundwater. So people say, well, but plutonium lasts so long, hundreds of thousands of years, how can we guarantee it won't get out and hurt people? Well, the coal waste lasts just as long. The arsenic, the lead, the mercury in it, these are elements. They're gonna last more than a few 100,000 years. And they do escape because we're so cavalier in just dumping it by the river in these pools. So that's the waste problem. Now, second, it's dangerous. It's scary. What's the reality? When I was a young environmentalist, we didn't know much about the history because it hadn't happened yet with nuclear power. We were still early in the process of developing nuclear power, and we were scared of it and thought it might turn out to be really dangerous. But now, we've had nuclear power for 60 years. And we know exactly how dangerous it is, and we can count how many people it kills and how many people coal kills. It's far safer than coal, hundreds of times safer. It reminds me of this other graph, very similar, of driving versus flying. You know, flying is actually very safe, but it's scary. When we took the plane here from New England, the person sitting in the seat next to us was like crossing herself as we were taking off, you know, like the plane's probably gonna crash. And that's natural. Planes are scary because you're not used to going up in the air and flying. But in fact, we know we keep flying because we're able to think, well, they're scary, but we know that once in a while a plane crashes and everybody dies, but most of the time it's a lot safer than driving to where you're going. It's the same thing with nuclear power and coal. Coal is dangerous, but nuclear power is scary. And if we could get those two things separated, what's scary and what's dangerous, then we'd be able to think more clearly about the picture. So, if you go back to the graph of coal versus nuclear, that little thin line for nuclear, almost all of those deaths came from one accident in 1986 in Chernobyl in the former Soviet Union. It killed about 50 people at the time who were sent in without protection to put out the fire, and they got radiation sickness and died, 50 people. That was because it was a badly designed plant, stupidly run by a government that doesn't exist anymore, and we hope won't again, the Soviet Union. And so those 50 people died. And then radiation was released into the atmosphere, and it got around Europe and so forth. Radiation is easy to measure in very small quantities, but it doesn't mean they're harmful. Large quantities are, like the people responding here who died. But small quantities that got out might or might not be. So the UN sent in 8 agencies and hundreds of scientists to study what were the effects of the radiation from Chernobyl, health effects, you know, giving people cancer. And they concluded that possibly as many as 4,000 people would eventually die from cancer as a result of that radiation release. So that's 4,000 people one time in 60 years. about the same number of people killed by generating electricity from coal every 2 days. So that's the scale, that's the difference. And yet we all remember Chernobyl as being a horrible, dangerous, dangerous thing. The Bhopal disaster in India, Union Carbide plant released toxic, lethal gas, and it killed about 2,000 people, worse than Chernobyl, and then many more over the longer term. And yet, nobody seems to talk about Bhopal disaster anymore, but everybody still talks about Chernobyl. It sticks in our mind. If we go to Chernobyl now and look at the exclusion zone around the power plant, people are gone, radiation is there, and nature has flourished. It's like this wonderful wildlife preserve, extinct species are coming back. It's not what you would expect, a charred wasteland from all the radiation. It's like the benefits of having people leave were much greater for nature than the downside of having a lot of radiation around. The second accident that people always raise, and usually in the tone of Fukushima, and usually with the word no in front of it, like, no, Fukushima. That's the response to my book anyway. Fukushima was a genuine disaster, but it was a natural disaster. It was the worst earthquake in Japanese history. That's a country prone to earthquakes, and a 50-foot tidal wave, tsunami. It came through and wiped out whole villages. It wiped out infrastructure. It killed almost 20,000 people. And then it also damaged the nuclear power plant at Fukushima. By the way, the one up the coast at Onagawa was undamaged by this whole incident because the person, I think it was one person, insisted that they have a higher seawall in case of a really, really big tsunami someday. And they did, and the plant was fine. Fukushima, they said, no, we don't need that high a seawall. And we'll put all our backup generators in a low-lying place. So the worst earthquake in Japanese history, the 50-foot wave, the backup generators are all in a low-lying place. They all get flooded. They all turn off. The plant melts down. The hydrogen explodes. The radiation gets out. It's pretty much the worst nuclear accident you can imagine. And yet, the radiation that was released to the surrounding public was never above the safety levels that we set for exposure to radiation. Just to give you a couple of numbers on that, the background radiation is about 3 millisieverts per year, which is the amount that a body absorbs of radiation. Anyway, if you live at altitude, it's a little higher, like 5. If you smoke cigarettes, it could be 9. If you work the crew of a transatlantic plane where you're really up high, it's higher than that. If you are around a granite building, which I hope you don't have any of here, granite's a little bit radioactive. And then there are hot spots in the world where it's just naturally elevated background radiation. The hottest of which is Ramsar, Iran, where the level's 200. Background is 3. As radium hot springs in Ramsar. So lots of experts have come into Ramsar to look at what the effect of this radiation on the population was, and they haven't found any effects on the population. So low-level radiation, not necessarily bad. At Fukushima, the level released was never above 50 for the general public. There were some higher doses for a couple of dozen people who responded, first responders to the accident, but none of them have shown health effects yet. It's possible they will in the future. So here's a natural disaster, kills 20,000 people almost, nuclear accident, doesn't kill anyone, and then Japan, in response, shuts down all their other nuclear plants and starts burning coal and natural gas instead to make up the difference. And Stefan and I calculated that about 10,000 Japanese have died from the effects of coal when the nuclear reactors were shut off. So 20,000 from the disaster, nothing from the nuclear plant, 10,000 from the replacement with fossil fuels, and what does everybody remember? The nuclear disaster at Fukushima. The third worst accident was at 3 Mile Island in 1979 in the United States. And nobody was hurt. The radiation that escaped was minimal. And yet, it had the bad luck of happening just when this major motion picture, that China syndrome with Jane Fonda, was in the movie theaters. And it even referred to possibly wiping out an area the size of Pennsylvania, which is where this plant was. So that, I'm not saying there was a conspiracy to create this accident just when the movie's in the theater, but it was a very effective result, which was that everybody was terrified of nuclear power after 3 Mile Island, and the United States stopped building nuclear reactors after that. But we're still burning coal today, and large numbers of people are still dying from coal today. The movies and TV shows, like the China Syndrome, are accompanying a 40-year campaign against nuclear power. I'll talk about it in a second, but it's been portrayed in various media extravaganzas, starting back in the early days with these monsters that were created by exposure to radiation. Godzilla, this creature from the deep that's going to take out Golden Gate Bridge. The radiation makes animals much, much bigger and angrier. And then, the movie goes from there. Godzilla was one of these. Spider-Man got his powers from radiation. There was kind of fascination with radiation in the early Cold War days that came through in media. Then we had The Simpsons, where it's just a cartoon, it's all in fun, but I think people do register that this must have some streak of truth in it, that nuclear plants are run by evil magnates, and they're very badly managed and release radiation all the time, and the fish in the river have 3 eyes, etc. And then in 1986, we had the movie Silkwood with Meryl Streep, one of my favorite actresses. And she's working in a nuclear plant, blowing the whistle on their bad practices. And boy, they look really bad in this movie. And then the nuclear industry hires thugs to murder her. Finally, in South Korea, just a couple of years ago, came this movie Pandora. It was just before a presidential election where one candidate was pro-nuclear and one was anti. Pandora shows a nuclear plant that's really, really badly managed and operated with no plans for any disaster. And the people who live in the village where it is all hate the nuclear power plant where they work. And yet, sure enough, the slightest earthquake makes the whole thing blow up and kill everybody. There's a lot of fires and explosions and dead people, people dropping from radiation, et cetera. And this came out just before the election. Greenpeace came and put a large publicity campaign behind it. And sure enough, the anti-nuclear candidate was elected president. And this has been the Greenpeace operation in South Korea is part of a 40-year campaign against nuclear power, which has now raised and spent hundreds of millions of dollars. And just think about it, all the publicity about how bad nuclear power is, all the demonstrations. Greenpeace is located not far from here, I think, the international headquarters. I think they call it Amsterdam. And they have thousands of people on staff and tens of thousands of volunteers and hundreds or millions of donors and supporters. And that's one of a whole series of organizations that are out there telling us over and over that nuclear power is bad. And this campaign is based on fear. It's all a fear campaign. Plutonium in your teeth, plutonium in your cornflakes, be very, very afraid. In Sweden and in the United States, public opinion polls show that women support nuclear power far less than men do. In fact, it's about 2-to-1 support among men and 2-to-1 opposition among women. So that's an interesting thing, but I take from it that women on the whole are more susceptible to these fear messages, especially directed at their children. Where are we going to leave our children? What's the danger to our children? And that's on the left, for our children, shut Pilgrim, that's the plant in Massachusetts, our only one, which is closing down at the end of May because people don't want nuclear power. Taking with it more clean electricity generation than all the wind, solar, and hydroelectric in Massachusetts combined. So in one day, we'll take all that out and go back to scratch. On the right side is the very small countervailing movement of people starting to support nuclear power. This is Mothers for Nuclear, and they're also doing it for their children, to leave our children a clean planet, clean power, and save our children from climate change. All the fears about nuclear power, although magnified by this large campaign, trace back to the early Cold War years and the fears of radiation that I lived through and everybody in my generation. I remember hiding my head under the desk, and I remember the placard on the wall of my classroom that showed sirens you might hear from the local emergency alert system, one of which meant in 30 minutes, the nuclear bombs were going to arrive and you were going to die along with your family, your community, everything you knew, and probably the whole of humanity would be wiped out. 30 minutes notice. This was very traumatic and is carried with us, the whole generation, forward from there. I think that the fear around atmospheric nuclear testing is also a big part of this fear of radiation because they were blowing up atomic weapons in the atmosphere, on ground level, not underground like they started doing originally, and it was throwing fallout around the world. And then we were told that in the event of a nuclear war, there would be vastly larger amounts of fallout, and it was going to be extremely bad for anybody that was exposed to it. That's the kind of fears you hear around nuclear power now, that the radiation will get out and it'll do terrible things. The connections between nuclear power and nuclear weapons in the mind were very important, and they were important in the early days of civilian nuclear power, because there was a program to go from nothing nuclear to creating nuclear material, and it was going to be used for weapons, but it was also going to be used for electricity. But that process has kind of gone in reverse now. In fact, for 15 years recently, the Soviet Union's nuclear warheads were being taken apart, shipped to the United States. In the end, 80% of the warheads in the US and Soviet Union were taken away, dismantled, and the United States was burning the material from the Soviet warheads to power our nuclear reactors for civilian electric power. So 10% of all the electricity in the United States for 15 years came from dismantled Russian warheads. So the connection between nuclear power and weapons has become, less important and even reversed. And the reason that it's not such a worry as it once might have been is that we have robust international controls on the civilian nuclear power industry. This person is installing cameras at a nuclear facility. The International Atomic Energy Agency goes out to all the nuclear sites in the world, puts in cameras, seals on canisters, inspections, snap inspections, to make sure that material is not diverted from a nuclear power program into a nuclear weapons program. And so far, that program's been really successful. Almost every country in the world has signed up to it. If you want to have nuclear power, you have to sign up with the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and you have to agree to all these inspections. Countries that were thinking of making nuclear weapons, and that once included Sweden, and more recently South Korea, have decided not to make nuclear weapons because they want civilian nuclear power. So that actually civilian power is a check on proliferation of nuclear weapons. Some of the countries that have made nuclear weapons, such as North Korea and Israel, don't even have civilian nuclear power. And Pakistan has both, but they're separate facilities. Because if you want to make plutonium for bombs, it's not efficient to do it in a civilian electricity producing plant. You build a plutonium reactor to make your bombs. And that's what they've done. And if you want civilian power, you build a power reactor and do it that way. All right, so that's the dirty and dangerous, and now we're up to expensive, which actually is the most important of these three critiques in real terms, although it's not what people react to emotionally. And it's true, this plant in Georgia is way, way too expensive. This was the first attempt by the United States after 30 years of not building nuclear reactors following the 3 Mile Island plant accident. First attempt to get back in the game and build nuclear reactors. They were going to build 4 of these Westinghouse reactors, and 2 of them in South Carolina got partly built and then canceled. And these remaining 2, the only 2 under construction in the United States, are years behind schedule and billions of dollars over budget. And that's a picture from last month. Like, these were supposed to be done a long time ago. It's costing per gigawatt, which is a typical size and about the size of each of these reactors, it's costing about $12 billion, and maybe more by the time it's done. And that's just way too high. In Europe, you're paying about $8 billion for the EPR and new build nuclear reactors. This was not true of the earlier ones. Sweden had cheap electricity, France had cheap electricity. But after this gap and building new designs for the first time, the cost has escalated tremendously. So does that mean nuclear power is just too expensive now? No, because look what's happened in South Korea. Well, we stopped being able to build them, forgot how, and they got too expensive. South Korea has been building this similar design with little tweaks over and over again, the same team, the same reactor, and every time they bring down the cost until they're now able, as you can see on the graph, to build it for about $2 billion, 1/6 of what it costs in the United States. So is the meaning of this that nuclear power is too expensive and we need to get rid of it, or should the United States start doing more of what South Korea does? And the things that it does, the things that make nuclear power affordable are, you need strong government support, that's for some economic reasons. You need to build multiple reactors at one site, that takes down the overhead. But most of all, most important, you need to standardize a design and build it over and over again. That's what France did when it built its reactors. And after they did that, one of our American Nuclear Regulatory Commission chair people concluded that in France, the difference between France and the United States was that in France, there were 2 types of nuclear reactor and 100 kinds of cheese. But in the United States, the situation was reversed from that. So we need to be more like France that way, more like South Korea. Pick a design, standardize, replicate. That's how any product works. The first one off the line is always enormously expensive, and then it comes down as you reproduce it. So then, even at $2 billion, you have another problem, which is, here's Wimpy says, I'll gladly pay you Tuesday for a hamburger today, but it's much worse for a nuclear power plant. You're gonna get paid in 30 years. You're gonna build a plant that's gonna return money to you over 60 to 80 years. And then you're gonna have to pay your $2 billion up front today. So you're gonna pay $2 billion today for a hamburger in 30 years from now. Excuse me, I said it in reverse, but you get the point. A lot of money up front for a long-term payback. And in a deregulated kind of market economy, that's a bad bet because you don't know what's going to happen to your revenue 50 years from now. Maybe someone will come out with something better 30 years from now, right? And it's hard to raise that much money. If you're a utility in the United States, a couple $2 billion up front, if it goes wrong, it could take your whole company down. And in fact, that's what happened to Westinghouse with those 2 Georgia reactors. Westinghouse went bankrupt because of the fiasco of how expensive they were. That's why government support's important, because a private deregulated market is not going to come up with money up front now to get paid back 30 to 60 to 80 years from now, especially if you have a discount rate of any significance. That's how much do you care about money in the future. And for a private company, they don't care much about the money they're going to get 50 years from now. It's not going to affect their quarterly revenue statement. So what new companies are doing, and there are dozens of startups now trying to do this around the world, are to make smaller reactors centrally built so as to get the cost down. To mass produce a reactor design, often a small version. This is a new scale, which is a small modular reactor. You might put in 10 of these instead of one big reactor. And that way you can build it for less money, you can get it out there, and then you can start getting paid for your electricity while you're building more of them. Some people in this field, these new startups, are especially keen on the role of thorium in new reactor designs. You might run into them. They're like, thorium, thorium. And thorium's a different fuel from uranium. It's more abundant. It's especially more abundant in India, which needs to build a lot of reactors if it's going to get coal out of its grid, which it really needs to do if you've tried to breathe the air there. So yeah, thorium to the rescue. That's Thor, the Greek god, with his hammer, in case you didn't recognize him. Some version of that. And this company, Thorcon, is trying to combine that, a thorium reactor that's a molten salt reactor. It's a different design. The United States built this in the 1960s and proved that it worked. And it's got a liquid fuel instead of the solid fuel rods. So the fission is happening while these molten salts are circulating around. It has some real inherent advantages, won't melt down and that kind of thing. But then, partly because the Navy wanted reactors that were good to go in submarines, we went with light water reactors, and the molten salt reactors went by the wayside, but now quite a few of these startups are trying to build molten salt reactors again. And this company, Thorcon, is trying to do this on a floating platform so that you build it centrally, just like on that truck with the new scale reactor. Build it centrally, send it to where it's going, pull up to dock. This dock is probably in Indonesia because that's who they're negotiating with to build out their first reactors. And then when it needs refueling and so forth, you take it back to base. So you've got 2 of them, one's working and one's cooling down. And you have a central base, not trying to do everything out in every country, which is also a proliferation advantage, to not have a whole infrastructure in the country, but take it back to a centralized place. And they want to build these in shipyards. This is the world's most advanced, one of the several, shipyard in Busan, South Korea. These people build large, complex, containerized vessels, liquid natural gas carriers, and think about how big a cruise ship is. These are in many ways more complex and larger than a nuclear reactor. And they're built in these shipyards, and the shipyards are really good at reproducing them, same design, multiple builds, and getting the costs down, really squeezing the cost out of building a ship. They've got a lot of excess capacity right now. They would love a new project like putting nuclear reactors on some kind of floating platform. A different version of this idea is proposed by MIT professors a few years ago. They said, why not take oil rigs, which is a very well-known mature technology, and nuclear reactors, another well-known mature technology, and marry them up with each other. So in the right-hand picture, the nuclear reactor is down below sea level, surrounded by water, which is a great place for a nuclear reactor because anything that goes wrong has to do with overheating. So you have an infinite cooling source. It's right there with the reactor. It's not going to melt down. And then above ground, the generation stuff. And you put it 8 to 10 miles at sea and run a power cable to land. Operating out there at sea has several advantages in addition to the large cooling sink. This is some kind of windmill infrastructure being pushed around, but you can see that from out there, it's not going to be the problem of not in my backyard that stops nuclear plants so many other places. People are not going to lie down in front of the bulldozer to stop this thing 8 miles out at sea. And psychologically, I think, although people are scared in theory, it's better if it's further away. Also, proliferation risk, again, to have it out at sea, not on land, means less chance to divert material from it. Security is easier to manage, and you can take the spent fuel away from there to a central location, maybe somewhere like France that can burn it, or Finland that can bury it, and you don't have the spent fuel accumulating on site. So those are several advantages for that way of doing it. If you can float a reactor and bring it anywhere in the world, you can serve more than half the world population that lives near the coast. That's where the big cities mostly are. So you can build a lot of reactors really cheaply, really quickly, and float them to where they're going. My little pet name for a floating nuclear reactor is a turtle. So you take a nuclear power plant, something we already know how to build, like this South Korean one. It's been built, it's been licensed, it's been exported, it works. And then you put it on some kind of barge or ship in the South Korean shipyards, and that's your turtle. These turtles then would be built, mass-produced in the Korea and eventually other shipyards and sent off around the world the way we now mass-produce airplanes. Now, I know what you're going to say. Airplanes sometimes crash. We just had 2 of them crash recently that got a lot of news, and that's true. But then I remind you of the graph. It's a lot safer than driving. Every once in a while, one does crash. If you build large numbers of these turtles, nuclear reactors, and send them all over the world, there will be some accidents with them. By the way, an ocean's also a good place to have a nuclear accident if you're going to have one, because the radiation's contained and doesn't affect the people on land. But you get your mind around the idea that we're going to stop climate change. We're going to have some accidents along the way, like with airplanes, but you're going to get in a system where you're cranking them out on an assembly line the way we do with airplanes. And eventually, you'll need to produce nuclear power plants on about the same scale as airplanes in the world today, jet aircraft. Maybe even twice that scale, but that's about the scale to operate on. And we can do that. We know how to do that. So now back to this graph of where the emissions come from. After you clean up the electricity sector by learning how to produce a lot of nuclear reactors, then we need to clean up industry, transportation, building, heating. And there are different ways to do that. The easiest way is to electrify. The way we do with cars, we have electric cars, they work, I'm driving one. But you could make hydrogen fuel cell cars, you could make cars that run on ammonia or trucks. But in each case, it starts with electricity. That's how you're going to power the chemical reactions that produce these substitute fuels. And we'll need that for aviation because batteries aren't going to work for aviation. We're going to need some kind of substitute that's carbon neutral, produced with cheap, clean electricity. We'll need to convert over steel production from coal-based to electricity-based. That's something we already have a fair amount of, but need to continue that. We need to make concrete with carbon capture, which is now starting to be done. Most of the concrete being made now is a big source of greenhouse gases, so that has to be fixed. And we need to heat buildings with air source heat pumps or some other electric way of heating, not with natural gas the way we do now. And then we'll need that last quadrant, which I won't really talk about, but the agriculture, afforestation, stopping deforestation. We need something like the Green Revolution in scale to teach new methods of agriculture. There's some good books out about that you can read. And eventually, as I mentioned, we'll need to sequester carbon out of the atmosphere. This is a pilot plant by a company called Carbon Engineering that will do just that. It runs the air through the fan, through catalysts, and pulls out carbon dioxide. They can do this now, but it's way too expensive. It's about $150 a ton. But over time, we can bring those costs down, develop that technology, and pull the carbon out. The problem with carbon sequestration from the atmosphere is that unlike cheap, clean electricity from nuclear power or some of these other ideas, it's just a cost. There's no economic benefit to it, except that you're stopping climate change, but that's stopping a bad, not actually giving you something immediate benefit. So we'll need some kind of diplomacy to parcel up those costs. We'll need to say, we need to pull out 10 billion tons of carbon or whatever, and here's how we're going to allocate the costs. But this kind of diplomacy where 193 countries all get together and issue a lot of statements is not the way to do it. I think we need something where the leading powers, probably just the United States and China, sit down in a room and hammer it out and sell it to the world. Something more like, Nixon and Mao, just two powers figuring it out. But those are tasks for the 2030s and 40s, the sequestering of atmosphere. The task for the 2020s is to deploy the massive amounts of clean electricity and to get on a path to deploy a lot more of it in the 2030s and 2040s. So that's our job. Probably deploy about 5,000 gigawatts, which would be about 3,600 of these turtles worldwide. So that's a lot in 10 years, of which China needs to build 700 gigawatts. That might not be floating turtle plants. That might be just standard concrete plants because China's good at that. They can build the stuff like the Amsterdam metro that we don't seem to be able to build anymore. If they would build 700 plants in a decade, they could take coal entirely off the grid. Their air would become breathable again. And that single action would reduce world carbon emission by about 12%. It would be by far almost the only successful thing that's been done to reduce carbon emissions, but by far the biggest thing. And then we need to develop that next generation, the Thorcons, the new scales, some of those ideas into something that we can roll out at even bigger scale in the 2030s and 2040s. Now, I want to speak about Netherlands for a couple of minutes, if I can, without offending anybody, hopefully. Netherlands is not successfully decarbonizing. You probably know that. This is the graph from carbon emissions per capita. So it's not exactly the same thing as the grams per kilowatt hour. This is per person, but same general idea. This is the overall carbon emissions. It looks, frankly, a lot like Germany's graph. Failure to decarbonize. And what might work better than that, since you're a good creative country and you've got Arjen Lubach to tell you about it, is to build some turtles. If you built 10 of these, you could power the entire electricity system of the Netherlands. Just 10 of those. And they would cost about $25 billion, maybe a little more, hard to say. The first one's going to be more expensive, then you start cranking them out. So that's $25 billion not spent out, never to come back, but invested in creating 60 to 80 years of cheap electricity for the Netherlands. If you can build these the way South Korea does, you can do what South Korea is doing right now, which is to produce electricity for 3.5 cents a kilowatt hour from nuclear power. Cheaper than anything in South Korea, even hydroelectric. And hydroelectric's problematic here. So 10 of these plants, all the power in the Netherlands. And so I'm going to make a modest proposal that why don't you just do it, you know? Build your 10 plants. And here's the thing, not only do you power your own electricity needs, but you energize the Netherlands economy, because a source of stable, cheap, clean electricity is what industry wants. It's what investors want. People like the data center company that just pulled out of a $4 billion project in Sweden because Sweden was shutting down its nuclear reactors and trying to replace them with wind power. And the company decided the electricity supply was unstable. And the grid operator is saying they're not going to let new people onto the grid. You don't want to be that country. You want to be the one that says, come here, we have reliable electricity. We have electricity that will power your company. And then you can start selling them around the world, because the Dutch will be the ones who have these turtles. You'll have the intellectual property, you'll know how to do it, you start selling them all around the world. And the plant manager in Vietnam who's about to build a coal plant is going to say, why should I build one of those? The Dutch will give me one of these turtles, it'll be cheaper, right? That's when you really begin to decarbonize the world quickly, because if it's cheaper, without a carbon tax, without a special government policy, without subsidies, then people will adopt it, and really quickly. So here you'll be building them, you'll be making a lot of money selling them around the world, probably get your $25 billion back pretty fast. And by the way, that's about the cost of building a new airport these days, or any kind of big infrastructure. There was a project to build an island out in the North Sea and put an airport there maybe a decade ago, if you remember. And that, it's that scale of expenditure. I'm not saying you should build the airport out in the North Sea. That's another subject. And then the final advantage or benefit of building these 10 turtles would be that you then have the electricity to begin decarbonizing the whole economy. Those things I was just talking about, electric vehicles, substitute fuels, electric air source heat pumps for buildings. And those too you can sell around the world. So now you're going to be selling the clean electricity revolution to the world, and the Dutch will not only be famous for saving the world, not for the first time, but will also be making money doing it. So that's my massive proposal. Did I say massive? I mean modest proposal. The people to do this is your government. It's not going to just happen. It doesn't just happen in a decarbonized system. Deregulated system of electricity production, companies won't just come up and decide to do this. You need a government behind it. And why not your government? Your government's one of the few in the Western Europe now that's even open to nuclear power. They could make it happen. You could make them make it happen because you have a democracy. And then you could actually succeed in stopping climate change and get on the right side of history. Right now, what I see in the Netherlands is you're following Germany, following the German model. We know it doesn't work. Germany has made a tragic, historic mistake with its Energiewende policy. Not the first mistake in German history. And I noticed that yesterday you celebrated Liberation Day from the German military, and so now why not follow up by liberating yourself from the German ideas of energy transition? Just a thought. And so you could have the right side of history. Do you want to be like Germany with a failure to decarbonize? Or do you want to be like France with a successful decarbonization? Or better yet, do you want to be like the Dutch, the country that innovates? The country that gave the world such wonders a few hundred years ago when this university was fresh, and be the ones that actually create the tools by which the world can decarbonize. Because if the world doesn't decarbonize, you're going to be flooded, regardless of how many wind turbines you have for your own electricity. So that's my modest proposal. The government can do it. I don't know much about Dutch, I don't know anything about Dutch politics. But I think you could do this, and if your present government doesn't want to do it, I did just see the election in Ukraine, and maybe there's a different way to go. Just a thought. All right, that's the end of the talk, and I'll be glad to take questions and answers and throw in vegetables and whatever you have for me, so thank you.
Thanks a lot, Professor Goldstein. I'd like to ask you to come down here, and I'm also inviting Gideon Laugs from the Energy and Sustainable Research Institute to give a short reaction on this modest proposal before we take questions from the floor.
First of all, Mr. Goldstein, thank you very much for this elaborate exposure on the benefits of nuclear energy. Let me first of all let me mention that I wholeheartedly agree with you on the fact that probably nuclear energy has some role to play in energy transition and moving towards a more sustainable energy system. You see that the times are changing. I think society as a whole is becoming more open to look at the benefits of nuclear energy. So there is a window of opportunity, definitely. But what I don't completely agree with you upon is the scale with which that role of nuclear energy might play out in, well, the short, medium, and also long term. Reasons for that, I think, is it's a combination of technical aspects and non-technical aspects. Let me start with if you want to, with the technical aspects first. And I think you briefly touched upon that with the intermittent renewables, variable renewables, solar PV and wind energy. And the intermittency is an issue, but with nuclear power, a similar issue arises. So the output of a nuclear power plant typically is fairly constant, whereas demand is not. So as you have with solar PV and wind, the output of nuclear energy will also be associated with an inherent mismatch between demand and supply. So in that respect, the integration of nuclear energy is only slightly easier than solar PV or wind energy. Therefore, also comes with a lot of associated peripheral infrastructure. You mentioned batteries or other forms of electricity storages to make it happen. So it's not just about the nuclear power plant; it's also about the further ramifications for the energy system as a whole. That's one element of the technical aspects. And there's also in terms of implementation. I mentioned grid adaptation first. Now we're looking at things from a specific temporal and spatial perspective. Temporal, you mentioned 10, 15 years for development in France and Sweden. Even though France and Sweden may have done that several decades ago, we've moved on the better part of a century in the meantime, and I think society as a whole has changed. It's no longer the 1970s and 80s. And I think society as a whole has become much more vocal and involved with everything related to these long-term, high-impact strategies. So a government may have pulled this off several decades ago, but I'm quite hesitant to assume that it could be equally possible in today's society. So not leading to delay and much slower implementation than the 10 and 15 years. And in terms of spatial, and I think that's interesting looking at the title of your book, so the rest can follow. The rest kind of implies to me the rest of the world, right? It's not limited to the developed countries only. And you showed in the beginning of your lecture that most of the rising energy consumption and thus rising carbon emissions is not from the developed countries, but from the developing countries. And I'm not exactly sure what the likelihood is of implementing nuclear energy in the developing countries. You call them poor. I don't think whether poverty has anything to do with it. It's a matter of having the technological capacity to build, operate, maintain, and run a nuclear power plant under conditions that the rest of the world would consider safe. And there's a temporal and a spatial element to it. But quite frankly, that's not the most pressing concern I have with nuclear energy in the long run. Because what I think is kind of interweaved in your speech just now is that by integrating bigger shares of nuclear energy, we can kind of safeguard our energy demand, energy supply for the next several centuries, and then continue with the way we run society and continue with that for a while. So that to me does not appear to be a paradigm shift. So we just continue doing what we did before, just using a different source of energy. I think when you really go to the essence of sustainability, it's not thinking about it as from what sources do we get our energy. It's about how we think about energy in more abstract terms. So to conclude and to converge a little bit, I'm a little bit less optimistic than you are. Nevertheless, you seem to make a very strong point in advocating the potential and putting more focus on the benefits of nuclear energy. Now, one question that came up with me is how you address some of the disadvantages, but you bring forward a nice supporting argument, let's say an Arjen Lubach, to have another look at nuclear energy, see what can we do, what can it offer us. Is it time to bring the benefits of nuclear energy to center stage? And so there's been enough attention to the drawbacks and the criticisms. Is it now time to take the criticisms off the stage and move the benefits in center stage? Is this the time that we're looking at?
Yeah, thank you very much for those comments. And the bottom line, I don't expect everyone to agree, maybe anyone to agree with my whole argument. I've been a bit provocative, I know, but I do think that nuclear power has to be on the table as part of the discussion. If we're looking at climate change seriously, you can't take the #1 clean energy source in the United States, #2 in the world next to hydropower, and just take it off the table. And, oh no, we don't like that, it's scary. It has to be part of the discussion. On the question of the essence of sustainability, do we want to do things differently and have a paradigm shift? Well, here's the thing, using more energy, the thing that I didn't like back when I was young, we're going to have an industrialized society, we're going to use more energy and instead of being more natural and more sustainable. I've changed my views on that. And it's because energy has brought so many people out of poverty in the developing countries. And China, it's been a miracle in China, but it's all happening on fossil fuels. So fossil fuels, on the one hand, are evil and bad because of climate change. On the other hand, they've been really great for people who want an air conditioner in a heat wave, and now they can have it because of the coal plant. So that's the trade-off. I don't think sustainability in itself is the goal here. I think stopping the catastrophe of climate change that we're now kind of staring in the face, that's the concern. Anybody that wants to lead a more sustainable lifestyle, you can. I was on a radio show where in Southern Oregon, somebody called in, we don't need all that stuff. I've been living on some solar cells and a bank of car batteries for the last 10 years, And what can you say? Like, good for you. That's great, but it's not. The world's not going to do what you're doing.
No, I agree.
And then the idea that we've moved on from what we used to be able to do a few decades ago is puzzling to me. So we used to be able to make electricity cheaply and quickly roll it out and all that, what France did. And now, no, we can't do that anymore. Is it because we've become stupider in the last few decades? Is it because the French are smarter than the Dutch are? I don't think so. Is it because we have less technology? We had this great technology and now we don't anymore. We used to have computers that would fit in your pocket, but now we're back to using slide rules. No, it's the opposite. We have more money, more technology, we're smarter now, and maybe even the Dutch a little more. And so it's just that thing that now the public is more involved, and we've had the big fear campaign, and so it's very difficult politically. I think that's a legitimate reason to criticize my whole argument, just to say people are too scared, and you, professor, are not going to change their minds, and therefore we'll spend 10 years that we could have been building more solar panels, and we'll spend it arguing about nuclear power because everyone will stop it from happening. On the other hand, I do see change happening in the discourse in the last few years, and especially right now with all the UN reports coming out. This is back on the topic. And political change can happen really quickly. I think of same-sex marriage in the United States. When my mother was a big advocate, we should have marriage for gay people like your brother, And then, 1 year it's like, oh, Mom, you're such a dreamer. And then it's like, whoa, she called that one. It happened so fast. So cultures change fast. And it's not just the technical issues, there's the political and cultural element that I think could go really fast.
Doesn't necessarily have to converge towards desirable outcomes, though. Now, what I thought was interesting, you mentioned both natural gas and Arjen Lubach. Well, since you've touched upon the Arjen Lubach issue with nuclear energy, I don't know if you've also realized the debate storm that emerged from it. Suddenly it was brought to the public attention again in a way that no one really expected, and that led to some serious social debate. So should we be looking at it again? So the public is becoming more involved. Now, you also mentioned natural gas in the beginning of your lecture. Now, especially here in the province of Groningen, natural gas has kind of a reputation.
I think I'm feeling an earthquake right now. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So it's.
Okay.
But so far, you've been bringing up a lot of facts. Well, one of the facts of the earthquakes in Groningen is that so far no one has died from an earthquake in Groningen. Nevertheless, the public opinion around this is so strong that it leads to quite substantial change in The Hague and a change of policy and a change of moving away from natural gas and doing things from a policy perspective that 10 years ago no one would have expected. Yeah. No one died.
Yeah.
So, and whether that's a positive move or not, that remains to be seen, depends on your perspective. But that's essentially, that's public opinion. And I think a lot of public opinion is also still involved with nuclear energy.
Yeah. So I'm joking about the earthquake because I know that, nobody died. I'm not actually worried that fracking is a danger. I am worried about the unburned methane going to the atmosphere and the carbon dioxide going from burning natural gas. It is incidentally a good argument for moving your energy production offshore because that's what's going to solve your problem here.
Yes.
Out of sight, out of mind, put it in the North Sea. Be it nuclear, gas, or anything else that people don't like.
Once the gas is finished, you can remodel the...
Yeah, no, but we don't have that long. That's the trouble. And we have really cheap natural gas in the United States, thanks to the fracking revolution. Mm-hmm. And it's really revolutionized the economy and politics and been very good for the economy. Cheap energy is great for the economy. That's another reason that you can't just say, well, we'll take out natural gas and we'll replace it at 3 times the price with something that we consider to be greener. Or with nuclear power, the way we're doing it now. Nuclear power is carbon free, so if we have to pay 12 cents a kilowatt hour, we should just do it. That's not going to work, right? Because people will lose their jobs, people will vote their governments out of power. So it has to be cheap. This technical issue of the constant output is a good one. I think that for both nuclear power, but even more so for renewables, you can use the unsteady output when there's too much electricity to be making some of those substitute fuels. Mm-hmm. And it's not as economical as doing it around the clock because your capital expenditure is sitting there unused part of the time, but that's a way. Also desalinization and also carbon sequestration from the atmosphere. So when you have too much electricity on the grid, like the sun's shining and the wind's blowing and the nuclear plants are going, and yet nobody's using it because they're all on vacation, then you can be sucking carbon out of the atmosphere with it. And when you don't have enough, that's when you need the nuclear plant to be producing when the other ones aren't going. So it is an issue, but I think not that big of one. Did I miss anything there?
I think you.
I think we might want to have a look in the audience. There are questions for Professor Goldstein, quite a few. Okay, I think you were first with the brownish jumper, and I saw someone.
Yeah. Thank you for your very interesting talk. I was wondering, nuclear energy and uranium is actually a fossil fuel in itself as well. On the scale you propose your plan, how does that take into account? Because it's quite a bit bigger, the amount of nuclear reactors you're proposing now than there are currently used on planet Earth. So
it is a lot more. It's not a fossil fuel. It doesn't use a carbon-based molecule that splits apart and creates carbon dioxide. But are you talking about like using concrete to build the plants and so forth?
No, I'm sorry. I'm talking in the sense that it's not a renewable. I should have mentioned that.
Yeah.
It's you can use it currently sort of once. Maybe in the future you can reuse it, but as it is now, most plants can use it one time.
Yeah, and you can recycle it like the French do to use multiple times, but actually the cheapest thing might be the once through, mine it, burn it, and dispose of the waste or save it for a later generation. But I don't understand why that's a problem, and especially because the volumes are so small. If you took all the radioactive waste, the spent fuel from all the American reactors for 60 years and put them all in one place, they would fit in a Walmart, you know, a big box store. And so, you know, if we took, as we saw in Lubbock, you know, you take the one person's nuclear energy for their whole lifetime, it fits in an apple. This was the thing about Lubbock that I thought was so effective, was because people are afraid, he used humor. And we should figure out more ways to do that. You know, we should have a comedy show here instead of an academic. Yeah, so, you know, the apple that represents the size of your one person's waste. And then he says, but I wouldn't want to eat that apple. And everybody laughs because they're nervous about it. You know, and then he says, oh, wait, it's a uranium delicious. And everybody laughs again. And then you can deliver the information because you've gotten through the fears. I don't know how to make a mass marketing campaign or something out of that, but I think humor is important.
It does.
I think there was another question. Yes.
Yes, thank you for an interesting presentation. I'd like to go back to two things you said, namely, nuclear energy isn't clean, but neither is coal. And then secondly, we need to solve with the uranium problem or the contaminated waste problem in the long term, but we can do that whilst we decarbonize, etc. But isn't that the kind of attitude that got us where we are in the first place? Let's future generations solve it and just go for what's best at this moment.
Well, we're in the generation now that has the future of the planet in the balance right now. And this is the big moral issue of our lifetimes. And what are we leaving for our children and grandchildren? Climate change, that's the problem. We have to solve it. And so this kind of philosophical issue of the way of thinking that got us in trouble or something, I want a practical solution. And maybe I'm not enough of a theorist, but I want something that's proven to work and that offers a way to actually solve the problem. The way my son told me to do, like, how are you really going to solve this problem? Because you're leaving us a terrible, terrible mess from what you've created. So if I can solve that problem, and I do it in a way that's not the essence of sustainability or not, you know, it represents the way we've been doing things. It's all those things that I felt when I was younger too, why I didn't like nuclear power. But if we can solve it, then we have a moral responsibility to do it. People right now feel there is no solution. I don't know how people here feel, but in the United States, everybody just thinks that we're doomed. You know, we're cooked because they realize the renewables aren't adding up. And yet we don't really have another problem. And then we've got this political divide in our country where, you know, half the people don't believe in climate change and the other half don't believe in our largest source of clean energy, nuclear power. And then everybody's like, oh, we're doomed. And that's a formula for inaction. So if we can have some hope and some action, and somebody has to jump into the fray and show us how this problem can be solved. That's what the Dutch are going to do when you start building your floating reactor turtles. And then people say, oh, that's a good, you know, we can do that. Pretty soon everyone will be doing that. And we'll have some hope.
Simon has a question.
So, Joshua, many thanks. I agree that there is a potentially important role for nuclear power to play, but I think your presentation really lacks nuance in a way. So there is a sense in which I think nuclear is uniquely unsuited to do what you envisage it to do, right? So you've shown the example of France, but you've also hinted at the collective action problem that is climate change, right? So it's best for everyone, in anyone's individual interest to use cheap energy, to use fossil fuels. And then, but you have also indirectly pointed out that to make nuclear power cheap, you need like a long-term commitment that has to come from the state. You need to think about future generations. You need to make commitments actually for your children and their children. And that's just what is so hard, right? So, and that's why I think Gideon is right to point out that it's unlikely that we will very often see the success of France replicated. And so I think there are and actually these are things that to scale up renewables, which you can mass produce in factories already, and implement relatively unbureaucratically, that has serious advantages. So I think the overall picture is far more complicated and gray than you suggest.
Well, both of you have said in somewhat different words something like we need a more sustainable energy system or something. That's not what we need. We need to radically decarbonize. It's a massive project that's bigger than anything humanity's done, maybe ever, for a long time. We need to completely take the world economy, which is, almost $100 trillion worth of economic activity, and shift it from 85% fossil to 0% fossil in 30 years. So we're not looking to move in the right direction. This is like a chasm that we have to bridge, and you can't build the bridge halfway and get to where you have to go to. You have to complete the job and get to the other side. So that's the problem. If we were trying to get halfway, I'd be with you on the renewables, and maybe we mix in a little nuclear, we have some conservation, they're all good ideas, they're all moving in the right direction. And it's this tendency to say, what's my part, what's my carbon footprint, I'll reduce it, and then I'm doing my part. And that's not a responsible thing to say. We each say we're doing our part, but it doesn't add up. We're trying to solve the problem from the bottom up is the problem. And when you go from the bottom up, you're not getting there. We know we're not getting there. We've spent $2 trillion on renewables in the last decade, and we haven't had any decarbonization at all in the world. I mean, Germany hasn't been able to do it. Yeah, so we're not getting there. We're not solving the problem. Each UN report that comes out shows how far off track we are. And that's my basis for these more radical proposals, because otherwise we're not going to get to the goal.
One more question?
Is it on now?
Yeah.
Thanks for your talk. It's great. I mean, I completely agree with everything you said. But I'd like to clarify.
Thank you for that question.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost hearing myself speak, if I can say that. No, but in Holland we believe that the nuclear waste problem is unsolvable. That's what we've been told. We don't know that it is actually already solved. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The other thing is that we believe that proliferation is unsolvable. And that both these things together means that you can never use nuclear, and you could better have climate change than use nuclear energy. So that's a bit of background in Holland. But the question I want to ask you is how we can break the chicken and egg deadlock that we have in the government, because the Dutch government now says that nuclear is not an option in Holland because nobody is coming to the government asking to build a power plant. So they have a chicken and egg thing. The government doesn't realize that it has to make the move. So I wonder if you can comment on that.
Yes, well, how you affect your government here, I'm not an expert on. I did just read the government policy on energy that said that nuclear power was on the table. It's a possibility among the clean energy sources. But most of it was really about natural gas. We'll be burning gas for a long time, but we'll build renewables, or that kind of a policy. So I didn't like that, but nuclear was possible. How you influence your government is to, well, I don't know, like in the United States now, maybe you have it here, the school children are marching out on Fridays. We had them in our little town last week. I look and there's a bunch of little kids, out there. They marched out of school. And I think that the momentum is catching on to pressure governments to solve climate change. And then if that's serious, then nuclear power may get a look in there. And then this was partly to the earlier question about how do you bring about change when the public opinion is kind of hostile. Well, it's different in different places, I think. And here it may be hard, in Germany really hard to get the government to build nuclear power plants. But in China, there's no such problem. And China, I mean, it's true. If China decides today they want to build 650 nuclear reactors and take coal off the grid, they can do it. The reason they're not doing it is nobody's shown the spotlight on them and said, hey, you could do this, and you should. Remember the graph of China's carbon emissions. It's more than the United States and the European Union put together. So that's half the coal in the world is being burned in China. And so I think that, it's different in different places. And I don't know what the solution is for you. I just know you should build 10 of these things and show us how it's done.
If I might briefly react to this, I think what you mentioned, bringing about a change of mindset in countries like the Netherlands or European developed countries, the countries where the kids are marching out of school. That might very well be a possibility. And let's assume, for the sake of the rationale, that it's possible, and that indeed the Netherlands decides to spend $250 billion on building 10 of these turtles. That would mean that
25 billion for the 10 of them.
10 of them, right?
Because you're building them in shipyards. Well,
Let's
let me
just assume
just
that we
say on
ship
this,
down.
because I'm getting some looks here. So South Korea just exported these on a concrete build, basis, on-site construction, which is the expensive way, to the United Arab Emirates, where a bunch of Koreans have to go over and work in the desert building them, and that was $4 billion per gigawatt. They're building them at home in South Korea for $2 billion a gigawatt. So 10 of them, that's 20 billion. The max would be 40 billion if you want to turn it into a desert and make the South Koreans come here like in the United Arab Emirates. But something on that order of magnitude. It's not 250 billion.
But anyway, the cost aside, I think in the face of climate change, all cost aspects become negotiable. What I mean is, if it replaces some part of a fossil fuel use in some country, if you ship it out, but that means it also frees up fossil fuel resources for use in other countries, which do not have any of these turtles floating around. So, and by changing demand and supply, it might actually become cheaper to buy the fossil fuels, especially for countries still in the early phase of development. Might become more interesting to buy these cheap fossil fuels and spur their development as well, with all the consumption associated with it.
Yeah, it's a non-trivial point that if you start displacing a lot of fossil fuel, the price may go down because Saudi Arabia can pump it for a lot less than they're selling it for.
You get this
So
massive
that's a problem.
rebound effect.
But has to do with the earlier question too, that the way to get it to spread quickly is to make it cheap, right? Then you're competing, you're out competing it, and it's stupid to use fossil fuels because you can do it cheaper with nuclear. Anything that's more expensive than fossil fuels, then you're having an argument and you're talking about moral responsibility and the surcharge, how much more should you pay and leave the planet for your grandchildren and all. Not as good as here's electricity cheaper than what you're paying now. So that's why I really think that's the way to go if you want quick change. I also have a theory about people's fears that if electricity was 2 cents a kilowatt hour, let's say, people wouldn't be so afraid of it. And it's kind of an odd jump.
To test that.
But, if something's convenient and productive and useful in your life, then you get over your fears about it the way we do about flying. And some other things that are kind of inherently scary, but we do them because they work. So, but if you're going to ask me to do something scary and then my electricity is going to cost more, then that's not good.
Okay, I think we're running out of time a little bit. There were 3 more questions, and I hope they're reasonably short. I think you have the microphone at the moment, and then you in the back, who I keep promising, and I think someone over there had a short question as well. Sorry, but we're running out of time. Please.
Yeah, well,
maybe 10, 15 years, and then it's all gone. And you scale it and out.
So,
A remark, I totally disagree with my neighbor, because part of your talk are talk of amateur. For instance, Chernobyl. Why is there so less radiation? Have you any idea?
why there's less radiation?
No. Directly after the blast, there was
There was,
That's why, that's because it was all blown out over Europe. Norway, Sweden, the Netherlands, France. There is the radiation gone. Not in the neighborhood.
yeah, we all know the radiation spread across Europe, but how high were the levels and what were the health effects of it? Because my source to answer that question is the United Nations experts, the 8 agencies that came in to study it, the scientists, the people who understand radiation effects, not something I read on the internet, not something that Greenpeace told me, not something that Helen Caldicott said that 1 million people were killed. I have to trust the United Nations agencies whose job it is, who spend their lives studying health effects of radiation. And this is what they said, possibly 4,000 cases of cancer, maybe a few of them are in the Netherlands, I don't know. That's 2 days of coal deaths. So yeah, that was a bad accident. There's no doubt about it. But that was one accident in 60 years of nuclear power.
Sorry. Maybe.
You don't want any radiation, but you're getting radiation right now, walking around in a soup of radiation because well, you're getting more if you fly in an airplane.
Excuse me, maybe we can continue with the questions from the back.
Thank you very much for your talk. As far as I understood, to make the whole thing feasible, it will largely depend on our ability to mass produce those electric reactors. And as we've seen with Chernobyl and also the German energy transition, there always exists the possibility to oversee something and then make a mistake and only find out afterwards. So how can we deal with the consequences of mass producing one type of reactor and then later on find out that something is wrong, one of those blows up and we probably have to shut all of them down and then don't have any source of electric.
Well, let's answer your question by substituting aviation for nuclear power. So if one jet crashes, do we shut down all the aviation in the world? No. We go in, we study the accident, we try to improve how we do things, and then we keep flying. And eventually another one will crash and we'll come in. And because of this attitude, we've brought down the risks of aviation. It's become a lot safer than it was when I was a kid. And with nuclear power, we have this special standard that nothing must ever go wrong. I have a theory that there should be more nuclear accidents in the world, since I'm being provocative. Because if nothing ever happens, and that's very close to where we are, 3 accidents, only one of which was fatal, in 60 years, right? 2 days of coal deaths in 60 years of nuclear power. So then you get the idea, this is the standard we have to uphold. No jet must ever crash or all of them have to stop flying. But if jets crash every once in a while, then it's a statistic, right? Like, okay, some people died, but most didn't. It's safer than driving, and then you can think about it in that way. That's all I'm asking about nuclear power. Think about it the same way, costs and benefits. The risks of coal, the risks of nuclear power, the risks of natural gas. They've all got their different risks. But if you can think about it in that way, other than I don't want any radiation or, we have to shut them all down if anything happens. I told you what happened in Japan. They shut them all down and 10,000 people lost their lives to horrible diseases like cancer because they burned coal instead. So.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that the nuclear industry has had a very bad message, which was this is so very, very safe. And they say it so many times that you think it must be really dangerous. And they say, we'll make sure that no Fukushima ever happens again. And that's wrong. It probably will happen again, especially if we build a lot of them. And there will be accidents. There might be an accident as bad as Chernobyl. It's possible thousands of people will die. But the risk of that versus the risk of what we're doing now with coal and the risk of climate change, there's no comparison. It's much safer. So I'm not going to say, yeah, we'll build thousands of reactors and nothing will go wrong and nobody will die. It's not that way at all. Probably 1 in 100 will have an accident. I don't know, 1 in 1,000, some small number, and it's possible some people will die. And same thing with the waste problem, by the way. You bury the waste. How can we make sure it never, ever gets out? Well, it probably will get out someday if it's there for 600,000 years, and it might kill hundreds of people in 2,000 years from now, what's that look like compared to the risk of climate change to hundreds of millions of people? So it's all relative, and I just want to look at the risks and benefits in a rational way.
Okay, thank you. I think we have one last question.
Hi. You said in your talk that a lot of the perception about nuclear power is based on films, etc., which seems like the kind of worst way of making a decision. How do we take a debate that's so kind of culturally influenced away from things like film into a more scientific space?
Well, where's Lubach when we need him, right? I think that the films are very powerful. I would like to see some kind of pro-nuclear film, just because Oliver Stone could make something, where the fossil fuel companies are trying to conspire to shut down nuclear power, but it's trying to save the world. If he makes it, probably the fossil companies will win. But it's hard to make a movie that's as entertaining based on hope as it is to make one based on fear, put it that way, Like, it's easy to make, if you want me to make a movie about a nuclear disaster, it's just easy to think of things that are going to be really entertaining and all the explosions and the death and all that. But if you want me to make a pro-nuclear power movie where nothing ever goes wrong, it's just, nobody's going to want to go to the box office to watch it. So it's a problem. But I think Lubach maybe will save us.
Okay. Well, thank you all very much for coming, for your questions, for your insights, for the discussion. I think we have a little present. Simon has a little present. So maybe your last one.
Thank you so much. It's a little bottle of wine with a uranium delicious apple.